So like anyone else in their 20s, or really anyone in general whose brain is dying a slow but noticeable and aching death, I scroll on social media as normal and am suggested Bleach content here and there on my For You pages, specifically since I'm a creature of habit and a big fan of the series. I see Bleach, I click like, algorithm gonna algorithm, etc. and so forth. But scrolling one day, I was suggested an interesting post from Bleach Arc on Instagram, with the topic of discussion being Ichigo with access to every Shikai and Bankai versus Uryu with every Quincy ability, but we could also say every Schrift for the sake of clarification. This question isn't necessarily anything out of the ordinary, as some in the Naruto community may recognize these sorts of debate topics, like what if Itachi had the Rinnegan, or what if Shikamaru with the Sharingan fought Rock Lee with the Byakugan. And this is essentially what this topic is as well, so I thought it would make an interesting topic for a video today to go over who exactly would win between these already strong characters if they then gained these extraordinarily broken and powerful abilities were presented throughout the series on top of their existing arsenal. Zanpakuto are as easily identifiable with the Shinigami as the very Shihakusho on their backs. Every Zanpakuto first starts as an Asuchi that eventually becomes a unique sword in its own right based on the shape generated by the soul of its user, but this becomes less and less common the lower ranking the Soul Reaper themselves is. Every Zanpakuto is capable of both a Shikai and a Bankai release that can change or grow stronger, all depending on the capabilities of those who wield the Zanpakuto and the relationship with the spirit that resides within. With access to every Soul Reaper, Shikai, and Bankai, Ichigo's arsenal becomes considerably more vast than it was presented to be in the original manga. Ichigo's own Bankai ability, as described by Byakuya, allows him to fight with maximum force at super high speed. Databook 1 reinforces this concept of Tensa Zangetsu's ability, stating it channels all of the Bankai power into speed, thus allowing the user to battle at a feverish pace. It is small compared to other Bankai. While this on the surface seems deceptively simple enough, later on in the war arc, Ichigo would discover that everything he knew about his Zanpakuto as well as himself and his history indeed proved to be false, as he learned more about the hollow light that resides inside of him as well as his Quincy heritage. This would result in Ichigo then attaining his true Shikai reflective of his real capabilities, now two dual-wielded blades, and attaining his true Shikai would likewise mean that his Bankai before was more than likely not representative of his true ability either. The only issue, however, is we never get to see this true Bankai ability in the manga, considering that when he attempts to employ its use against Yuha, he probably responds by snapping it in two. This is something that may be reconciled with the new Thousand Year Blood War anime adaptation, but for now his true Bankai ability remains ambiguous. On the other hand, considering that Ichigo's Shikai is essentially his base form with no noticeable discerning characteristics in terms of unique abilities, there isn't really much to discuss there, aside from maybe a separate video discussing the concept of a constant release Zanpakuto, which both he and Kenpachi were theorized to have had in the past. Speaking of Kenpachi, just as Ichigo and his Bankai, Kenpachi's likewise provides him with an increase in his physical stats. This is evident over the course of his fight with Gerard, as while Kenpachi struggled fighting V1 Gerard in his Shikai, he turns the fight massively over in his favor after utilizing his Bankai for the first time. Other captains in the 13 Court Guard squads possess some varied and unique Shikai or Bankai abilities, a good example being admittedly weaker captains like Soifan and her Shikai, Suzumebachi, that allows her to eliminate opponents by just making 2 moments of contact. On the other end, we have captains like Shinji Hiroko and Sosuke Aizen, whose Shikai abilities revolve around illusions. While Shinji's Sakanade Shikai reverses its target's perception or the world around them to where even speech is slurred, Aizen's Kyokusuigetsu represents a full and complete hypnosis. In his own words, appearance, shape, size, texture, and even smell are affected. In other words, a fly can appear to be a dragon or a swamp a flower garden, and the spell is activated when the victim bears witness to Kyokusuigetsu's release. This could be used to play a variety of tricks on one's opponent, even making them believe they're fighting someone that was never there in the first place. Other characters like Shunsui have more so elaborate abilities like his Shikai that turns children's games into reality, or his Bankai involving a complete theatrical performance, and those caught inside cannot interrupt. Some possess Shikai or Bankai abilities that are more so focused on defense, such as Kisuke Urahara's Kanon Biraki Benehime Aratame that reconstructs whatever it touches, making for an excellent healing Bankai since it can reconstruct even organs such as eyes and so on. Urahara's Shikai likewise heals those who enter its mouth for a brief period of time, similarly to the Naraka path of the Rinnegan from Naruto. The extent of Minazuki's healing ability is somewhat ambiguous, but it more than likely may fall short when compared to Unohana's own use of Kaido or the healing arts. Soya Azashiro's Bankai from the Spirits Offer Over With You light novel has plenty of defensive prowess as well, given how it fuses its users with their surroundings, to the point that Azashiro himself could essentially teleport wherever he may wish within the Serite and become unreachable to his opponents by taking on the properties of intangibility from the very air around him. As I'm sure is more than evident to you by now, Soul Reapers possess a variety of abilities that could not only take up an entire video discussing not just the sheer amount of them present throughout the manga, as well as some of the novels, but there are many different combat applications as well, given the intellect intellect or clever planning of each individual user of a Zanpakuto. The Quincy are certainly nothing to scoff at either, and while Uryu seems to have fairly good or remarkable efficiency in regards to the practice of the usual skills inherent to the Quincy race themselves, like archery or Hirenkyaku, he additionally has his own Schrift granted to him by Yuha, this being A, the antithesis. When chosen by Yuha to join the ranks of the Stern Ritter, a Quincy undergoes an engraving ritual, where Yuha implants a letter representing a specific power into their souls by drinking a cup of his blood, and upon the death of an individual possessing a Schrift, said power returns back to Yuha himself. Uryu utilizes the antithesis in his battle with Jugram to simply reverse their positions and give Jugram the wounds placed onto him, but his language implies he could in theory do far more than this, which we see in the new Thousand Year Blood War anime adaptation when he trades his restraints in Senjumaru's Bankai to Senjumaru herself. As Yuha's previous right hand, Jugram Haschwald has a similar Schrift to Uryu's, being B, the balance, where any misfortunes that occur to him are absorbed by his shield and can then be allocated to the fortunate that reside within his domain. Jugram notes that the balance and the antithesis don't necessarily match up well against one another, since while Uryu can in fact transfer his wounds to Jugram, the balance allows him to do the same, and the process repeats itself. Ranking alongside Uryu and Jugram are the Schutzstaffel, who while weaker than both Uryu and Jugram themselves, still employ some pretty good hacks. Askanaklivar's D, the death dealing, allows him to accurately calculate what amount of any substance he comes into contact with would be considered a lethal dose, and can alter that amount at will. For example, let's say that Fred Durst has 1.5 gallons of blood in his body, and a lethal amount of that blood would be 3 gallons. Askin can then alter that lethal dose amount to instead be 0.5 gallons, meaning that the amount of blood in Fred's body by default would now be a lethal dose. Gerard Valkyrie, on the other hand, seems to be able to overcome any obstacle with his M, the miracle, that replaces any parts of his body that may be wounded with what he describes to be God's size, bringing him back faster, stronger, and bigger than he was before. And this doesn't necessarily seem to possess any sort of limit, or at least any limit that were shown on screen, since this power was taken by Yuha before he could evolve past his version 3 state, where he surpassed the power of both Bankai Kenpachi and adult Toshiro. Pernaida Park Justice C, the compulsory, functions in a similar manner, where not only can it attach its nerves to its opponents to control their movements or even mangle their limbs, but it may also adapt or evolve based on the information that those nerves absorb. We see this take place when it evolves to the level of even Kenpachi and can pretty much negate every single one of Mayuri's responses to the compulsory until it consumes Nemu. Other Quincy beneath the Schutzstaffel utilize abilities that should prove useful in this scenario as well, like Asnot's F, or the Fear, which, as is somewhat self-explanatory, induces a fear effect into its victims to the point where they cannot attack and it becomes difficult to even operate their limbs. This is initially done via Asnot's targeting his thorns to make a wound or some type of contact with his target, but with his Volt standing, this proves to be even more of a bothersome ability, since the fear effect is instead induced through sight, immediately turning the tides in Asnot's favor. Though his time in the story is brief, Nianzol's W, the Wind, is also worth mention, since similarly to Gojo's limitless curse technique from Jujutsu Kaisen, Nianzol's Schrift wills and steers any perceivable threats away from himself and operates automatically. While we spent plenty of time going over the newfound abilities of both Ichigo and Uryu in this hypothetical, one thing that is also important to discuss is how the two compare to one another physically. In the past, I've spoken extensively about how Uryu is in fact a rival to this Ichigo in his true Shikai state, or maybe even stronger, as he demonstrates not only the capacity to react to him, but to damage him as well. This is expanded upon in episode 30 of the new Thousand Year Blood War anime, where the two have an extended fight sequence at the Royal Palace, where both repeatedly tag one another up until Uryu soundly defeats Ichigo. This means that at the bare minimum, the two should be able to keep up with and deal damage to one another, regardless of the abilities that play a factor in the fight as well. But I'm not really going to hold you for much longer, since I'm sure we can all agree that Uryu should take this pretty handily. One thing that must be said about Ichigo, regardless of whether it may be inverse topics about Bleach or cross-verse discussions including other series, is that he simply does not handle or match up well against any hacks abilities or hack-based fighters. Most, if not all, of his fights throughout the series have been against characters who, like himself, are more so physical fighters who use big potent attacks rather than complex hacks abilities. Byakuya, Ulquiorra, and Grimmjow are excellent examples of this, whereas whenever he's put up against those who more so fight using their hacks, he gets folded pretty badly. Part of the reason why Ichigo does as well as he is shown to against Aizen is admittedly because Aizen is suppressing Kyoka Suigetsu's illusions versus him. Then later on, Ichigo gets dropped by Askin's poisons, and when he goes to fight Yuha, it's painfully clear he has no answer to the Almighty and is repeatedly caught by the traps Yuha plans for him, kind of pissing himself when his Bankai is broken too. Not only this, but Ichigo himself does not employ the use of any specific or meaningful hacks. He's only provably familiar with his Bankai that, for all we know, currently increases his speed, as well well as his holofocation that further increases his physical stats. This may prove to be an issue in this fight as well, considering that a Zanpakuto and especially a Bankai are only as good as the connection between it and its user, and Ichigo with no previous connection to these different Bankai abilities or really any prior knowledge on how to use them to their full extent could prove to overwhelm himself in this fight against Uryu, who knows how to not only use his Schrift but should know how to use the Schrift of other Quincy as well by extension. If Ichigo attempts to attack Uryu by any conventional means of force, the wind will prevent this from happening. Ichigo may then respond by employing the use of a Shikai where he doesn't necessarily have to make contact with his opponent, such as Kyoka Suigetsu, and while on the surface this could work since the wind relies on the senses and instincts of its user, which Kyoka Suigetsu manipulates. The instant Uryu feels any sort of damage hit his body while under the hypnosis, he will reverse both he and Ichigo's wounds utilizing the antithesis or utilize the death dealing to make himself completely immune to Ichigo's spiritual pressure. Not only this, but Ichigo first has to release Kyoka Suigetsu in Uryu's sight for the illusions to work, and if Uryu sees this, it's possible he could reverse events to where Ichigo is instead caught in his own hypnosis. If Ichigo instead pops a Bankai where he doesn't have to make contact with his opponent, such as Katen Kyokotsu Karamatsu Shinju, Uryu can utilize the visionary to imagine that he is out of Ichigo's theater and leave him to die there before he can complete the 4 acts. If Ichigo then responds with someone like Azashiro's Bankai, as we mentioned earlier, to make himself intangible or make it more difficult for Uryu to react to him, Uryu can utilize the Volt standing of the fear to implant its effect into Ichigo through his vision, which is an automatic win con. But Uryu also possesses a similar intangibility through Lilebara's the X-axis as well. Ichigo can't exactly win in a straight up brawl either, since while he does have his own Bankai, Kenpachi's, or his holofocation to make himself both faster and stronger, Uryu possesses the compulsory and the miracle that will not only help him adapt to Ichigo, but eventually grow him stronger as well. Uryu may opt to intentionally allow Ichigo to damage him in order to create additional clones that adapt with the same exact arsenal using the compulsory, or that he can likewise do with the aforementioned visionary. This is all without mentioning that Uryu will now have the Almighty, which, as we discussed previously, Ichigo did not match up well against at all, compounding on the fact all Quincy abilities means he should have the capacity to steal the Bankai Ichigo uses and turn them against him as an insult to injury. As I mentioned prior, there is an extensive list of both Soul Reaper and Quincy abilities that we could spend a much longer video dissecting and pitting against each other, but it's fairly clear to see that even with just the handful of abilities we've taken into account so far, that Uryu just has way too many methods to hard counter any Shikai or Bankai Ichigo may have in his arsenal, with the option of even turning these Bankai against him using the Bankai stealing medallion, or even Pepe's the Love, as we see him turn Senbon Zakura against Byakuya, who he himself proclaims that one can only hold off against a Zanpakuto using Hakata for so long. While we did discuss prior how Uryu and Ichigo should be at a similar level to one another in their physical capabilities, this doesn't necessarily help Ichigo, as not only do Uryu's abilities hard counter his own, but they have the capacity to make him even stronger, overwhelming Ichigo in the end. But that's about all I really have to say regarding the topic today. I have plenty of other Bleach content on my channel and plan to make much more in the future, so subscribe for free if you don't want to miss that, or just to be notified of what I may get up to in the future, such as when I upload or stream. Like this video to support both the channel and myself, as well as let me know that this is the type of content you want to see. Comment down below if I missed anything or with any suggestions you may have for the future. Thank you all for watching and have a great rest of your day.